Welcome to BackStory, the musical journey of Leon and Malia. Award-winning duo Leon and Malia has been part of Hawaii's music scene for over 40 years, composing and performing a wide range of music in Hawaii and around the world. In this special series, we'll be hearing the fascinating backstories behind their amazing journeys in music, from Waikiki to the London Symphony, from the momentous triumphs of Hokulea to the Hawaiian cultural renaissance.
Aloha, I'm Leon Siu, part of the musical duo Leon and Malia. And today I'm going to be talking about my own backstory, and that is before I met Malia and before we became a team, a musical team. And so my backstory starts back on the Big Island. I was actually born in Hilo, but my family at the time lived in Miloli'i, which is a small fishing village in South Kona, and some of you may have heard of it. And Miloli'i was where I had my early childhood. But we also had a home in a place called Na'alehu, which is a plantation town in Ka'u. And so I spent my young childhood there as well. And eventually we moved, around 1955 or 56, we moved to Honolulu. We moved to Hilo. And there in Hilo, I started attending school, elementary school in particular. And it was really quite a nice time and quite a neighborhood we had in the Waiakea Homesteads area of Hilo. That particular elementary school was quite peculiar because it actually had a very robust music program, particularly a program in ukulele. And I would venture to say about 70% of the student body of Waiakea Waianae Elementary School played ukulele. And so I grew up playing ukulele from a very young age. Everybody started actual ukulele lessons at around 7 years old. And that led me into loving music, and particularly Hawaiian music, because we played a lot of Hawaiian songs, even though we also played a lot of kind of American songs, Stars and Stripes Forever and things like that. But it was a really good introduction, and it was a very, very wonderful situation in that we all played together. So there were, it was everybody did it, the whole neighborhood. All the kids in the neighborhood played ukulele. So we had quite a wonderful upbringing that way. My parents also thought that I should have art lessons. And so when I was 7, I started art lessons as well under a very famous painter, a Chinese painter who lived in New York and had his career in New York. And so he had moved to Hilo, and I had started classes with him from when I was 7. And I painted continually all through my life, really, or up through college. So I had these two loves in my life. I had music and painting, and I followed both of those tracks all through my career and through my life. At the Hilo High School where I attended, I was in the band as well and continued in music in that way, but I was also, of course, continuing with various art lessons with different teachers and learning different media in painting and in drawing and things like that. Eventually, I went to the University of Hawaii in Hilo, and I enrolled there. I had choices to go elsewhere, but I decided to enroll there because there was a particular gentleman who was an artist in residence. He had only come in for a couple of years in order to fill in for the art director or the head of the art department in Hilo, who had taken a sabbatical. So the painter who came in to take his place, his name was John Thomas. And so he was quite a well-known artist, and I decided I wanted to stay and learn painting from him. And I'm very glad I did, because I learned quite a bit more than simply painting. I learned a lot about art philosophy and about different philosophies of his that led to something he calls structural equivalence, which is something that actually is pervasive through all of creation. And this is that everything is built in a structure, in a grid, and that these grids actually assist or provide a pattern or a structure on which you can hang whatever art or whatever creation that you're doing, including music, dance. All of that actually conform to a grid. The grid is kind of invisible, but it's there. So I started painting under John Thomas and getting quite serious in that area. When John Thomas left the Big Island, went back to San Francisco, the area where he comes from, I continued painting in Hilo for another year while I was attending the university there. And actually I took over his painting studio, which was the transom hall of an old hotel. So I had the top floor with a skylight and a big wall where I could hang my work and paint. And so I had the studio of my own. And from there, actually, I sold a number of paintings to different collections around the world. So that was going on. But at the same time, I was also playing music. So around the time when I entered the university, I also started playing music on the side. I played at this place called the Islander Nightclub, which was a very, very popular nightclub in Hilo. And it was a place where a lot of visiting artists would come, particularly Hawaiian musicians. So while I was playing there, I met a lot of visiting artists like Eddie Kamai, Tony B., Sonny Chillingsworth, and then also a lot of other musicians from Hilo used to hang around there at the Islander nightclub. People like George Naope and Auntie Edith Kanakaole, although she wasn't really at the nightclub, but she was one of the musicians that I became very familiar with. And she's actually an old family friend. She and my mom go back quite a ways. So in working or doing my things in Hilo, I was, of course, quite inspired by the place where I was growing up, because the Hawaiian culture, of course, was quite rich, growing up in Miloli'i, as well as in Na'ale, which was more of a plantation town, but still there was a strong identity with Hawaii and with Hawaiian language and with Hawaiian music and Hawaiian arts. And in Waiakea School, of course, we played a lot of Hawaiian music. And then growing up and playing at the Islander nightclub, there was a lot of Hawaiian music being played there. The interesting thing is, however, that I was actually working in, or playing at that time, my interest was in folk music. So I bought a lot of folk records, and it was during the period of time of the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary and those. And so I began to learn guitar in the folk style. I had started learning earlier slack key guitar because my grandma had given me her guitar when I was about 10. And so it was tuned to slack key, so that's how I started playing guitar, slack key. But then later I became more interested in folk music, and so I started learning all kinds of folk styles. And in doing so, I became pretty proficient at it, and I met up with several of my friends from high school, and we started playing folk music, a lot of folk music, and we spent a lot of time playing. I would spend maybe 2-3 hours a day just playing my guitar and learning different songs from different records. So that was my background, and when I was playing at the Islander nightclub, I was playing a variation of Hawaiian and folk music. Then after my second year at college at the University of Hawaii in Hilo, it was only a 2-year university at the time, or 2-year program at the time, and so I had to move to Manoa. And so I moved to Manoa, and I got into the painting class in Manoa. All of my prerequisites were waived, and I went into the master's painting class. And it was quite an interesting situation because several of us were hand-chosen to just do painting. And so we were assigned a place in Manoa Valley, a house that the university had acquired from one of its botany teachers from another generation before. And the man's name was Dr. Agee. And Agee, this place is called Agee House, and it was on the way up to Manoa Falls. And it was a Swiss chalet that he had imported from Switzerland, board by board, and they reconstructed it here in Manoa Valley. If you are interested in knowing what it looked like, if you ever watch rap Replinger's Raps Hawaii program, you see the old man who's talking story, and he's the host of the program, and he's in front of AG House, which is where I had my studio. So, in fact, he's right under the window where my studio was. Some of the other people who were there with me in this master's painting class was David Farmer, who later became the head of the State Foundation on Culture and the Arts, and Eric Enos, who now is the head of the farms. Anyway, Eric Enos, and the father of Solomon Enos, the great painter. So anyway, so I was at the University of Hawaii, and I was playing music at the same time on the side. My friend Thor Wold, who had been one of my partners in playing music during high school, had also moved to Oahu to attend Manoa, the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And so we played music on the side, and we would play all kinds of things. We'd go to jam sessions and play here and there, and then eventually got some gigs playing. But a lot of times I just moved around as a soloist, and I went to different nightclubs and just sat in and played and jam sessions and things like that. So Thor and I did some concerts, and then at one time we moved into Waikiki, or we had a gig in Waikiki. And that was at a place called Amin's Restaurant, or Amin's Coffee House, I think it was called. And it was right at the triangle, or at the division, the split of the road between Kuhio Avenue and Kalakaua. And right there, right today, was where the King Kalakaua statue stands. But that was a nightclub at one time. And so we played there, and that was my introduction to Waikiki, and I started playing in other places in Waikiki. Waikiki at that period of time was really quite an interesting place because there were musicians all over the place. So there was a lot of live music at the time, and I would just go down the street and sort of sit in or watch some of the live musicians playing. Sometimes I would sit in, and other times, I would just kind of enjoy what they were doing. And there were people playing in Waikiki at the time, all kinds of Hawaiian musicians playing there. So it was really quite an interesting time. Now, during that time also, I forgot to mention, when I first moved to Waikiki, it was in 1968. And I was walking down the street and met up with a group of people who were just kind of sitting under a palm tree in front of the Royal Hawaiian Shopping Center at the time. It wasn't the big monstrosity it is now, just kind of a low-rise strip mall kind of a place. Anyway, so some people were sitting there, and I sat down with them and started playing my guitar. And one of them invited me to stay at their place, which was right there in Waikiki. And then a few days later, we were asked to go to a party down at the end of Waikiki, at the end of Kalakaua Avenue, at the foot of Diamond Head. And there, I ran into another musician, and his name is Liko Martin. And Liko and I became very good friends at that time. So we started playing music together, and along with Thor, who had moved there by that time. And then we had a house up in Palolo Valley where Liko would come and hang out, and we'd play music. And then we moved to Maunalani Heights, and we had a house full of musicians who were playing music all the time, and Liko hung out there quite a bit. And in fact, several of his more popular songs were written there, like Nanakuli Blues, which became known as Waimanalo Blues. So we were kind of a little group of musicians playing music and going out and jamming and just having just a good learning time and a good relationship building time. We were also getting involved with what later became the sovereignty movement, but at that time was simply us protesting and trying to save parts of our culture and parts of our land. So Liko and I would be called on to play at various sit-ins and demonstrations and concerts to raise interest. So Waihole Waikane, of course, and then there was the Santos farm out in Kalama Valley. Later, it was Protect Kaho'olawe. All of these issues started to come about. And at that time, of course, by that time I had met Malia, so that's for another period of time. But anyway, going back to 1968 and playing in Waikiki, by 1969 I started playing at a place called the Pieces of Eight. And I played there for several months, and then I was asked to play across the street at a place called Chuck's Cellar. And Chuck's Cellar was a very, very, it was a steakhouse, or actually a prime rib house. And we used to, I used to play there in the evenings. I start at 10 o'clock and go on through the evening until about 2 or 3 in the morning. And then, but before me, I think from 6 to 10 or something like that, Jay Laren, the piano player, used to play there, and the composer, of course. And so we go back quite a ways as well. At the same time that I was playing at Chuck's Cellar, there were also, like I was saying, lots of Hawaiian music being played all around Waikiki. And that's when Melvin Lead was at Gauguin's, and Elma Viri and Ed Kenny were at the Halekulani Hotel. And there's music all over the place. There was a place called the Beef and Grog, which is where the Royal Hawaiian Shopping Center is now. And the Beef and Grog had all kinds of live music. Across the street was a place called the Cock's Roost, and there was live music there. In the International Marketplace, there's live music there. So it was music, and all the hotels had live music. In fact, a guy named Animal Keale was playing at the Waikiki Biltmore, and Animal Keale is, now you know him as Mo Keale, but back then everybody called him Animal. But he was this ukulele player with a fantastic voice, and so we got to know each other back then. So it was quite an interesting time there in Waikiki. So what I wanted to discuss, not so much the chronological or the historical order of things, but really about what was going on at the time. And like I said, folk music was really quite strong when I was growing up, and particularly in my high school and college years. And there were many things that were going on during that time as well. And of course, one of the biggest things was the Vietnam War. And there was the anti-war movement, and of course in the 1960s there was also the flower power movement and all of those types of things going on, in which it really changed society into being something a little bit more reflective about political things as well as cultural things that were going on. And so the counterculture movement was very strong in the 60s and moved on into the 70s as well. So during that period of time, music was going through a huge transition from folk music and this idea of social responsibility and this idea of peace and of making sure that we can live in harmony together. Those are the major themes of the folk musicians of Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary and Kingston Trio, and so many others. During that period of time, I was quite strongly influenced by the folk music scene as well as what was going on. In 1964, I actually made a trip to New York and got to witness myself, still a teenager, but I got to witness some of the things that were going on there in the folk music, the hub of folk music at the time, which was New York City. And later I got to meet some of the stars, those that were creating the music. There was one particular gentleman that not too many people know about. His name is Phil Ochs. And Phil was one of the protest writers at the time. Very wonderful writer, and if you Google him, you'll find a lot of his songs. And he, along with Dylan, Bob Dylan, were really the major composers and bards of that period of time. So I got to know Phil Ochs, and we got to be friends. And later, when he moved to Los Angeles, I spent a little bit more time with him there in Los Angeles. By that time, Malia and I were singing together. But anyway, so in the period of the 60s, folk music again was very strong, and of course rock music began to become quite popular as well. So these were not popular, but it it moved to a whole new level of rock music, and it just changed music altogether. And then there was the melding of folk and rock in groups like Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and so many others that can't even name. But these types of things that were going on at the time were so significant, and I found out that that was what really influenced me in the later years, or influenced me throughout my life, was this involvement in this idea of social responsibility, and the idea of roots, of having roots, in that we need to remember where we came from in order to know where we're going. And this, of course, has become a big theme in the movement of the independence movement of Hawaii. And one of the things that occurred during that period of time in the early 70s was, of course, the Hawaiian Renaissance, so the late 60s, early 70s. So I was right there at the time when Hawaiian music was beginning to move into a whole new phase, influenced very strongly by folk music and, of course, by rock and the things that were going on around the world. The University of Hawaii at the time was a hub of the protest movement as well. It's kind of like looking back at the occupation of Bachman Hall. Recently, I was remembering of the occupation back in the 60s of Bachman Hall, and that time it was in protest to the Vietnam War, and how so many of the musicians, folk musicians as well as other musicians, were quite engrossed in providing time and leadership and attention and support for what was going on. And my own philosophy was not so much anti-American. It was really anti-war, and trying to see, can't we find a different way to settle our disputes? And so that's my roots are in that period of time of trying to look deeper and trying to search out where we as musicians, as artists, can make a difference. And so it was a very inspiring time for me, because lots of musicians were responding to that call. And so that influenced the music Malia and I were to write later quite a bit, and as well as the art background that I had in understanding that the role of the musician, like the role of the artist, is really one as a prophetic role. In other words, we image things for the future. We say, this is where we want to go to, this is where things ought to be. And we actually help to set a vision for those who come after us and for those around us at the time, and saying that these injustices, these wrongs, and even the complacency needs to be challenged, and they need to be moved forward in a way that would make a better world. So even though these things sound so altruistic, they actually are the way that things actually function. That is, the artist paves the way ahead of the politicians and everybody else. The artist paves the way of setting the vision for the society. And in doing so, we actually help as artists to form the future, and to make that vision take on a form of reality. So you set the vision, and then the vision becomes more embraced by the society, and the society as a whole becomes bettered by what you've done. So I am really glad to have this time to be able to share with you about my background. Again, coming from a little village in South Kona called Miloli'i. The other part of me is that I became quite involved in cultural things as well, particularly with canoes. And my grandfather was a canoe builder, and in fact, Recently, there was a canoe that was built in Miloli'i by my grandfather that was refurbished and is now sitting on the beach there at Miloli'i. It's called Malolo. My grandfather built that canoe along with some other of his friends in Miloli'i in 1932. My mother at that time was 7 years old when the canoe was launched. And the canoe actually had a very profound influence in the future. Now, again, I'm a canoe person from the standpoint that I see canoes as how our forefathers saw them, that there are modes of transportation as well as of livelihood, that you need canoes to fish from. So my grandfather built fishing canoes, but there was this one time, 1932, he and friends built a racing canoe. And that racing canoe became influential in that it started to dominate the races. So in the early, I think it was in the 50s or so, maybe in the 60s, the canoe was acquired by a canoe club here on Oahu, and a mold was made from that canoe. And that mold became the fiberglass form for many of the canoes that were used since then. So my background is toward canoes. And one thing I did want to say about canoes. So when most people think about canoes, they think about racing canoes. Those are a fairly new invention. But the canoes of our forefathers were voyaging canoes. And of course, there were practical canoes or fishing canoes. There were canoes for transporting to get from place to place. And also there were war canoes. And so when we think about canoes, we need to think about the entire scope and how that had a major profound effect on our entire culture, as well as many, many other aspects of our culture. So I'm going to leave it at there because I'm getting a bit far apart. But just to say that my background from the fishing village in Miloli'i is tied into canoes and into music and into art. So mahalo nui loa. Thank you so much for having me share this time with you. Mahalo. Aloha. Mahalo for watching this segment of BackStory, the musical journey of Leon and Malia. I was able to share my part of the story previous to Leon and Malia, and next month we're going to have Malia sharing her part of the story previous to Leon and Malia. So stick around. Next month will be the episode with Malia sharing her backstory. Aloha.